Okay, so previous video ended with sort of another glowering criticism of people who know better than me, and the Arab Spring movement. I'm just going to take this video to talk about some different protest movements of which social media has played a major role in. Now, the Occupy movement happened around about the same time as the Arab Spring, so we're talking really in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, the global financial crash of 2008. So really Occupy began with Occupy Wall Street in New York City. It was Occupy London, just outside St Paul's Cathedral, and a number of Occupy protests grew up around the world. Now, Occupy at the time again was identified as a form of social media protest. In particular, it was identified with the hashtag, and the emergence of Twitter as a communications platform became very important, and the sort of mobilization and organization was thought largely based on social networking. So a general survey that was done amongst Occupy Wall Street activists, and I have the link to it there, showed that face-to-face communication on the internet were the activists' most important means of obtaining information. Very important about obtaining information about the Occupy movement. So Facebook, word of mouth, websites, and email. Email, of course, being important back then, played a very important role, but both direct face-to-face interaction and mediated interaction therefore have always been critical. So because the Occupy protests, in a different way to the Arab Spring protests, used social media perhaps more as a core activity of what they were doing and how they were organizing, which is indicative of the kind of people who were involved. This was not in an Arab country, it was in New York City, where social media use at that time would have been more prevalent. Now that was confirmed by the Occupy Media survey in Christian Fuchs' work in 2013. Broadcasting and newspapers had a much less important role for Occupy than the internet, and Facebook was very, very popular. However, older forms of online media were actually more important. Email and websites, much more important than YouTube, blogs, Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook. So Fuchs's argument really was that we shouldn't overestimate the role of Web 2.0 in protests. What you had here was more mature communications technologies online, such as the simple website and the sending of emails. They were much more fundamental to the Occupy movement than social media, which had emerged a few years earlier. Now, Jeffrey Juris's work is very, very interesting. Jeffrey Juris is a former PhD student of Manuel Castells, so Castells would have been his mentor. He conducted a lot of participant observation at Occupy Boston, which he was a member of. Now, Juris's work says that whereas the global justice movement primarily used mailing lists, that is, email lists, and was based on a logic of networking, the Occupy movement is based on a logic of aggregation, based on which social media result in the viral flow of information and subsequent aggregations of large numbers of individuals in concrete physical spaces. Now, what Juris ostensibly is arguing there in this logic of aggregation is that flows of information are very, very important. That a continual flow of up-to-date information is critically and vitally important. This is not to say that social media produced these things, but actually that people being in spaces and being able to share large amounts of information were the basis for the protest, not stuff was on social media, so the protests happened. Actually, it's kind of the other way around. People were there and producing that material, and that maintained the protest itself. Social media didn't create it, but it did maintain it. And Paulo Garabo also makes similar points in his book Tweets in the Streets, which is very much based on Occupy, but also protest movements in Greece and Spain and other countries as well. So Garabo interviewed 80 activists in the USA, Egypt, Spain, UK, etc. What he found was, although contemporary social networks and social movements claim they are leaderless networks and they're distributed in their terms of their function, and that's an important aspect of social media, There are always soft leaders who make use of social media for choreographing protests and constructing a choreography of assembly. A handful of people control most of the communication flow. This is not the kind of model that comes out of what Castells is thinking, which these are, highly distributed protest movements because they're highly distributed networks that they're using. Instead, you have a variation on the old audience theory idea of the two-step flow model of audience, where you have information and, as noted here, soft leaders, influential people who drive the protest forward with their activities online. So you have a hierarchy of people here, and those hierarchical individuals involved in protest movements become very, very important. They become, if you like, totemic and idealized within individual movements. These are the people who have their finger on the pulse. These are the trendsetters of this movement. They're the ones worth listening to. And that kind of goes against Castells' idea as well, that if these things were just produced purely through social media, you wouldn't have this kind of hierarchical model necessarily. Now, referring to, and use Tahrir Square in the image from 2011, Miriam, and I'm terrible with names, I guess I do apologize, but Oraga, I believe, argues that the overt fascination with social media gave the impression that the revolutions were mainly middle class and secular. Western experiences were taken as the model for Arab revolutions, evaluated through the lens of modernity, going hand in hand with the idea that social media plays an important role in developing a sense of modernity or updating countries. Really what this criticism is all about is that, the idea that these revolutions were created by social media gives a prevalence to a Western view of the world and a prevalence to Western techniques and Western media as being empowering and having the ability to change the world, and are involved in kind of updating primitive countries abroad. It's a very, very problematic view. Now, it's clear that social media played a role in the coordination of protests. However, to call these events social media revolutions misrepresents what happened, especially when we consider social media was shut down in Egypt frequently during this time, and so it couldn't have been a Facebook revolution. Me Too can be seen as a very different type of thing. So these protest movements, Occupy, the Arab Spring, they're physical movements in many ways. They're based on occupation of particular physical sites, but there is a different type of protest that can go on through social media, and it's arguable perhaps that this kind of protest is more social media than the others and has had very, very positive results. So Me Too can definitely be seen as a different kind of social media protest. It's not centered on the same kind of political action because there's no direct target apart from the patriarchal structures of society, but it's a movement based on the sharing of experiences and much more so on this notion of contestation of the hegemonic order. And what I mean by that is, if we accept that the patriarchy and patriarchal ideas are hegemonic within Western society, the Me Too is a contestation of the most troubling and problematic aspects of patriarchic behavior and patriarchic ideology in Western societies. And it's a use of social media to share experiences from women in order to challenge the underlying assumptions of the patriarchy, of the patriarchy itself, I should say that, but also this hegemony of patriarchy. So, Me Too sheds light on social media as a site of this hegemonic contestation. Social media provides a platform to share information and experiences that reveal the hidden experiences of women across the world and surface these publicly via social media and through protest. So we can suggest this is much closer to Castells and Jenkins' notions of networked action, and it's also important to note that Me Too is challenging this hegemonic order. Hegemony, if you've forgotten, is the leadership or dominance of one group over others, closely linked to ideology. So in this context, we're talking about the dominance of men over women and the ideologies that go with that. The Me Too movement challenges the hegemony of patriarchy in societies. It's challenging ideologies at play rather than the authorities at play, which is the big difference, I guess, with Occupy and the Arab Spring and a movement like Me Too is it's the focus which is very, very different. And therefore, the type of protest itself is very different. It takes a very different form, but equally, very contingent on social media and very, very interesting for us to understand. So if you look at Me Too in historical context, we get Me Too emerges in 2016 when that idiot became president of the United States. A man accused by more than a dozen women of sexual assault before his election in 2016, and I'm sure now he's out of power, we're going to hear a lot more of this. I hope so, anyway. No surprise that Me Too becomes visible when Donald Trump becomes president, and it can be seen as part of a constellation of protest movements against Trump, albeit Me Too, I think, is global and has a great deal more to say than being, a protest against a particular political leader who has bizarre and horrible views on women and the role of women in society. Albeit, I think these things should be correctly linked together. So, in terms of understanding Me Too, if we look at Mendes et al. 2018, the Me Too hashtag began trending on October the 24th, 2017. The phase was initiated, first of all, by Tarana Burke in 2006, but it gained widespread attention when Alyssa Milano used it as a Twitter hashtag in response to allegations of sexual assault by Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein. Now, we know what happened to Weinstein, right? Me Too has power, and thank goodness it does. Through the Me Too hashtag, Milano encouraged members of the public to join in to showcase the magnitude of the problem of sexual violence. This captured public attention and was used 12 million times in the first few weeks alone. So, remarkably successful way to get people to move in. Much like Gabaudo was saying about Occupy movement, though, it takes the interjection of a celebrity, in this case Alyssa Milano, in order to power forward and to have, traffic, if you like. So what happened here? Well, survivors took to social media to share their experiences, engage in a call-out culture, which has in itself become a kind of problematic term in itself. And I think in the context of Me Too, call-out culture was exactly right. This is victims, using the power, using the opportunities and the affordances that they're given by social media to call out, sexual assault, rape, general misogyny, sexual harassment in a safe way, in a supportive environment. I'll come back to that. But it follows a growing trend of the public's willingness to engage with resistance and challenges to sexism, patriarchy, and other forms of oppression. Makes visible and challenges rape culture, misogyny, and harassment, and follow the hashtag been raped, never reported, for example. So this historical context needs to be acknowledged. Trump was involved in many historic and ongoing allegations of sexual assault and harassment, long history of degrading comments about women. Definitely that historical context played an important role. It is wrong to suggest that Me Too and the Resist Trump movement, which emerged at the same time, are the same as one another. However, the cultural protest that Trump gives shapes to both. Trump is the Twitter president, and protest at him through the social media is appropriate, transforming Twitter into a site of political and hegemonic contestation if the target is there. Right? What I want to say just before moving on to the next topic, obviously, is one thing that we have to acknowledge with Me Too is the underlying assumption of Me Too was that this would be a way for women to share their experiences in a safe and relatively anonymous way. Of course, social media doesn't work like that. And even those who could share their experiences in an anonymous fashion found themselves being attacked on social media through the form of threats of violence, rape threats, death threats by people. Now, that is a defense of the hegemonic order. I make no defense of any kind of behavior like that. I understand it as a defense of the hegemonic order, but we can see then that social media also gives rise to backlashes against protest as well, which can be horrendous for those involved in them. And it's one of the glaring flaws of Twitter that they are so pathetically unable to protect people on their platform. You know, people can get threatened with all sorts of things, and nothing happens to the perpetrator of those threats at all. You know, it is abysmal how that business is run, and you know, really, Twitter should have been shut down a long time ago. It's just a forum to abuse people by, in safety. The safety is on the part of the abuser, not, you know, there's no safety for the abused. So Twitter is abysmal in that sort of sense. And one of the problems with social media protests like this is the protesters do get attacked with horrendous abuse, which we need to take into account. Now, social media protest is not going to go away at any point in the future, but we need to understand that the effectiveness of social media protest depends on the number of users, like Me Too, millions. The target is it appropriate to attack that target on social media? You know, Joseph Kony was never going down because people were talking about it on Facebook. Weinstein did, you know, and you know, the patriarchy and, you know, challenging patriarchal ideas can be really challenged on social media. The ideological foundation of the protest itself is important. The effectiveness of communication, Me Too is brilliant. You know, you're talking a 5-letter hashtag. It's you know, as a piece of communication is fantastic. The effectiveness of the message and the context that the protest happens in. You know, and Me Too happened at a time when people wanted to hear this stuff. You know, with Trump being elected, with the world in the state that it was, people genuinely wanted to hear these stories. And it's important, therefore, that protest fits into a historical context in which this will work. Okay, thank you guys for listening. We'll talk a bit about the dark web in the next lecture.